始めます。稲賀茂美です。英語バージョンです。1-1です。Retrospective from an Oblique View. Shigemi INAGA from the International Research Center for Japanese Studies, Nichibunken and Graduate University for Advanced Studies, Hayama. In 1979, one of the major events of Japonism studies took place in Tokyo, in combination with an exhibition held at the Sunshine Building in Ikebukuro. An international symposium was held, and more than 40 years have already passed since that time. And among the panelists today, I happen to be one of the rare persons who closely observed the event of that period. The proceedings of the symposium were published as Japonism in Art from the Kodansha International in 1980, with, as you see, Dr. Chizaburo Yamada as the general editor, and who was assisted by Mr. Tatsuji Omori. As a graduate student, I was asked to help editing the exhibition catalog, and that is Ukiyo Print and Impressionist Painters, Meeting of the East and West, which was held in 1979 and 80, and which was also edited by Mr. Omori, the curator at the Bridgestone Museum. Thanks to the success of the event, the Society for the Study of Japonisme was founded the following year in 1980. Among the founding members, Seiji Oshima, author of a pioneering work on Japanese studies on your right side, and Chuji Ikegami took initiative in the project of translating into Japanese the famous and legendary monthly Le Japon Artistique, which is being launched in 36 volumes from 1888 to 91. In the translation work, Toruhaga and Shinichi Segi also took part, composing editorial board, and I was the youngest among those who were named translators. In my retrospective from an oblique view, let me summarize the genealogy of Japonism studies since the 1980s in the following 3 points. First, a shift from ukiyo print and impressionist to the studies of rather industrial and decorative art. Second, Japonism in academic painting. And third, Japonism in combination with religious studies. At first, let us examine some of the illustrations of Le Japon Artistique. The color reproduction shows a vase and ceramic bottle. These pieces turn out to be a reproduction of Kanko Zusetsu, edited and compiled by Inagawa Noritane and printed in lithography in the year of 1867. The Kanko Zusetsu with the title in French translation, as you see on the screen, shows that the publication was intended to the foreign Western connoisseurs. Among them, and here is also the case, you can see the reproduction. Among these connoisseurs were Edward Sylvester Morse, a famous Oyatoi Western teacher who was much interested in Japanese ceramics, and he frequented Inagawa's studio in Kojimachi, Tokyo. His huge collection now in Boston and Salem includes a piece named Sobakai Yaki in the Musashi province, and it has been included in the Kanko Zusetsu, indicating that Morse made his collection faithfully following Inagawa's instruction and guidance. The fact that the piece is illustrated in his catalog shows the importance Morse attached to this piece. And it was mainly thanks to the pioneering PhD dissertation by Ima Yuko that revealed the connection and network which existed between Inagawa, Morse, and European Japonism like Samuel Bing or Louis Gons. And Louis Gons, as you know, asked Bing to write a chapter on Japanese ceramics in his L'Art Japonais, published in 1883. Now, second point on Japonism in academism. which can be well illustrated in the case of Yamamoto Hosei. In fact, 1980s were the years which marked a kind of paradigm shift in the studies of 19th century Western art. The modernism, which had been highly praised and celebrated for some decades, was facing a drastic revision. One of the earliest tendencies in Japan may be the inauguration show at the Gifu Prefecture Museum held in 1982. Instead of the conventional scheme of highlighting the Impressionism, the exhibition in Gifu put emphasis on the reconstruction of the Parisian artistic milieu in which Hosei Yamamoto was initiated. Hosei, as a disciple of Jean-Léon Gérôme, doyen of the Académie des Beaux-Arts, tried to transplant oil paintings with historical and mythological subjects in Japanese soil. And the Urashima, a picture, the return of the Urashima from the Dragon's Pass in the ocean, is a typical case. And Hosei's teacher, Jean-Léon Gérôme, was not foreign to Japanism. His oil painting, entitled Japanese Imploring a Deity, obviously made use of some souvenir photo of the great Buddha in Ueno, together with a huge Buddha at the Serenus Museum, to conceive and realize his imaginary Japan. Jerome's influence and the costume of the person in front is borrowed from Hokusai manga. Jerome's influence cannot be ignored among the contemporary Japanese artists. Takeuchi Seiho, who visited Jerome's studio while he was in Paris at the occasion of the World Fair Exposition Universelle de Paris in 1900, showed his fighting spirit, I would say fighting spirit, toward the French master when he executed the combat of Cox in 1926. Not only Seiho's lion, but also that of Yoshida Hiroshi in his quintessence Seika around 1910 seems to have been executed in emulation with the French academic painting. Keiko Inatomi has already pointed out, as a possible source of Yoshida's inspiration, Peter Paul Rubens' famous Daniel in the Lion's Den, executed around 1914 and 16. And curiously enough, the same lion had already been appropriated by Oda no Naotake around 1770 as his adaptation from Ian Johnston's description of the natural history clearly shows. This brings us back to the Akita School of Western style painting. My starting point as an art historian was an article on the reinterpretation of Western linear perspective in Tokugawa, Japan, and its return to Europe. The exaggerated contrast between the far and near in the Akita westernized paintings is further pursued by Hokusai in front of his formula published in Hokusai manga, where Hokusai subdivides the pictorial plane into three parts, namely the land, the sea, and the sky. And curiously enough, one of Edouard Manet's seascape, sur la plage de Boulogne, deploy the same kind of spatial layers subdivided into three by horizontal lines. This small study is quite shocking for its apparent lack of compositional concern. And yet, if one tries to subdivide the piece vertically into three, one can perceive a hidden calculation through which Manet meticulously orchestrated this apparent spatial disorder. Judging from the size of the canvas, one may even suppose that Manet was intentionally imitating the Kyoe print of similar size, where three individual pieces are put together to make a panorama. And it is only several years later, in 1871, that Manet demonstrates his well-informed familiarity with the combination of three pieces of Japanese prints when he executed in Huppo, where Bertmo Rizzo is sitting in front of Kuniyoshi's story of the stolen jewels in the Palace of Dragon King. The key person who connected money with the Japanese art was Theodore Dure, on whom I made my PhD in 1988. It is well known that Dure, together with Henri Cernussi, escaped from Paris immediately after the Commune and made a tour du monde, visiting Japan. And in Tokyo, they made a purchase of a new a huge bronze Buddha known as Buddha de Meguro. Originally, and that Buddha was originally located at the precinct of the Vanjuji temple, as you see on the right of the illustration. The diary kept in Zojoji in Shiba records that the fact which happened on 2nd and 3rd of October 1871. They paid 500 ryo for the purchase of the Buddha. In his Voyage en Asie, Dure vividly describes how they bought the Buddha, and despite the petition of the surrounding inhabitants. And it was in 1983 that Bernard Franck, then professor of Collège de France, who identified the temple as Banryuji in Shimomeguro. From here, the great Buddha made the exodus. The pilgrimage was organized, and the abbot, Venerable Yoshida Yoshio, came all the way to Paris the following year to pay tribute to the long-lost main statue. I was asked to serve as interpreter at the moment, and I skip the anecdote today as it is already meticulously narrated in my paper published in 1998, both in Japanese and French. Let me remind you another surprising discovery made by Bernard Franck, the identification of the Bodhisattva Mahastama Prapta. The piece, conserved in the Gime Museum from its founding days, turned out to be a piece which originally belonged to the Horyuji Temple in Ikaruga. The remaining record allowed Bernard Franck to date the piece as executed in 2032 in Western calendar. And the sculptor was Kosho, one of the famous sculptors in the lineage of Unkei and Kaikei. The divinity originally composed the triad of the Buddha Amitabha in the golden pavilion of the temple Horyuji, as you see on the left side. Emile Gime, founder of the Gime Museum, came to Japan with a painter-illustrator, Felix Segame, and it is now well known that they paid visit to Kawanabe Kyosai, and the two artists made a competition by drawing each other's portrait. Vincent van Gogh, who did know Felix Segame and his writings, and his stay in Japan, could have heard of that anecdote. Indeed, one can find out in Vincent's letters a passage which strongly evokes the impression that Emile Gime himself got during his stay in Japan. In retrospective, I have to say that in the mid-1980s, Kawanabe Kyosai was not yet well known. Professor Yamaguchi Seiichi and Oikawa Shigeru made an extensive research trip around Europe and America to make new discoveries of forgotten pieces by Kyosai. And as for the Buddha of Meguro, as you have seen, in Cernussi Museum, this statue attracted few attention of the Japanese art historians in Buddhism studies, as the bronze statue casted in Edo period remained out of scholarly focus. The story of their exodus interested few specialists in art historical research. The same was true of decorative art for exportation produced in the Meiji period. And it was not until the vogue of historical research of the Exposition Universelle in the late 1980s around Yoshida Mitsukuni that the Japonism became a target of serious historical reconstruction. Such diverse disciplines as religious studies, history of socioeconomics, of trade and transactions, of commodity goods, and so on, were expected to collaborate with art historical scholarship. And it was not until recently that Felix Regame's sketches during his stay in Japan was seriously taken into account. A new Japanese translation of Emile Guimmet's Promenade Japonaise Tokyo Nikko, published in 1880, as well as the first Japanese translation of Felix Regame's Le Japon à l'image, published in 1995, are finally published in Japanese translation in 2019. Before his trip to Japan, Emile Guimmet seems to have met Kuki Ryuichi when the latter visited Europe for the first time in 1873. Thanks to Kuki's mediation, Guimmet's trip and research in Japan is said to be enormously facilitated. And again, in 1878, during the Exposition Universelle, Kuki made several negotiations with Guimmet for further cooperations. During his stay in Japan, Guimmet also met Makimura Masanao, de facto governor of Kyoto. Thanks to Makimura's initiative and mediation, Guimmet could make many appointments with religious representatives of diverse sects during his stay in Kyoto, including Shimazu Mokurai and Akamatsu Renjo. Transcriptions of their religious dialogues have been kept both in Japanese and French. The record in French is now available thanks to the edition established by Frédéric Girard, and who made also a lecture at the Nichibunken where we are working. Just mentioned here Kondo Tokutaro, whose figure can be identified in Regame's sketches, as Kondo served as the interpreter during Guimmet's stay in Japan. Kondo is remembered as having contributed to the development of the silk textile industry in Ashikaga. And let me finish with one more anecdote. The Buddhistic Pantheon. During his stay in Japan, Emile Guimmet asked Yamamoto Mosuke, sculptor in Kyoto, to produce the statue of Buddhistic divinities in concordance with the mandala inaugurated at the Toji Temple in Kyoto in the year of 839, 4 years later than the demise of Kukai. The 21 gilded wooden statues were completed on May 1878 at a price of 626 yen and shipped to Lyon, and then transferred to Paris to be exhibited at the Parisian World Fair, Exposition Universelle de 1978. The Panthéon Bouddhique was restored under the direction of Bernard Franck in 1968, and it was in 1989 that the entire composition made a first homecoming to Japan. Many of you have certainly watched the NHK High Vision special entitled 600 Deities Who Crossed the Ocean, Le Japon View par Emile Guimmet, which was on air in the year 2003. Emile Guimmet was also active in inviting Oriental guests, Koizumi Ryotai and Yoshitsura Hogan of the Nishi Hongani Temple made a ritual of Ho-Onko in praise of Shinran on 21st February 1891. And following the World Parliament of Religion held in conjunction with the Chicago Columbia World Fair in 1893, Doki Horyu on the Shingon sect was also invited to the Guimmet Museum and held the ceremony of Gohoraku on the 13th November 1893. Doki in Paris made correspondence with Munakata Fumakusu, then in London, and their friendship saw a development in their new reinterpretation mandala as a tool of perceiving the entire world in interdependence and interrelatedness. Their observation is relevant more than 100 years later, and we examined in a recent published book, Image Studies Today from Avi Warburg's Mnemoshne to Neurological Bildwissenschaft. The German version of the same book, Bilder als Denkformen, is just published in the year 2020. So the Japonism or Japonisms in German expression thus opened up a new window to the current epistemology, stimulating the intellectual dialogue between the East and West in search of new methodologies in visual cultures and studies in brain studies and cognitive perceptions. With this observation, I finish my talk. Thanks very much for your attention.